It's a sweltering summer day in 71 BCE, and you're traveling down Rome's most famous highway, the Appian Way. But instead of the usual merchant caravans and military columns, you're confronted with a sight that would haunt the ancient world for generations. 6,000 crucified men line the road for 120 miles, their bodies a grotesque monument to what happens when you challenge Roman power. These aren't foreign enemies or common criminals. These are the remnants of Spartacus's slave army, left to rot as a warning that would echo across the Mediterranean. But here's what most people don't understand about this horrific display. It wasn't really about punishing dead rebels. This was Rome's desperate attempt to restore something far more precious than territory or treasure: military discipline. Because 3 years earlier, something unthinkable had happened. Roman legions, the most feared fighting force in the ancient world, had turned and fled from escaped gladiators. Not once, but repeatedly. Why did Caesar make this crucial error? Actually, this wasn't Caesar's mistake. This was Marcus Licinius Crassus facing the greatest crisis of Roman military confidence in generations. The man who would later join Caesar and Pompey in the First Triumvirate was staring at a problem that threatened the very foundation of Roman power. What do you do when your own soldiers refuse to fight? Consider what you would have done in Crassus's position. You're commanding 8 legions, roughly 40,000 of Rome's finest soldiers. These men have conquered Gaul, defeated professional armies, and brought entire nations to their knees. But now they're cowering before a ragtag collection of escaped slaves led by a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus. Your soldiers aren't just losing battles. They're abandoning their weapons and running like frightened children. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Rome in 73 BCE controlled most of the Mediterranean world. Roman eagles flew from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the deserts of Syria. Roman roads carried Roman law to millions of subjects who had learned to fear and respect Roman military might. The empire that would eventually stretch from Hadrian's Wall to the Sahara Desert was built on one fundamental principle. Roman soldiers didn't lose to inferior enemies. But Spartacus wasn't just any enemy. Unknown to most Romans, this Thracian warrior possessed something more dangerous than gladiatorial combat skills. He understood Roman military tactics from the inside. He'd served in Roman auxiliary forces before being enslaved, which meant he knew exactly how Roman legions fought, how they thought, and most crucially, how they could be beaten. The rebellion had started small, almost laughably so. 73 gladiators breaking out of a training school in Capua should have been a minor police matter. Rome had dealt with slave uprisings before. They were an unfortunate but manageable consequence of an economy built on human bondage. But this breakout was different. Spartacus didn't just want freedom for himself and his fellow gladiators. He wanted to expose the fundamental weakness at the heart of Roman power. Here's the tactical reality that terrified Roman commanders. Their military system was designed to fight other organized armies, not guerrilla forces that could blend into the civilian population. Roman legions excelled at set-piece battles where superior discipline, equipment, and tactics could decide the outcome. But Spartacus refused to play by Roman rules. He struck at isolated garrisons, ambushed supply columns, and melted away before Roman forces could respond. The psychological warfare was even more devastating than the military tactics. Every Roman defeat encouraged more slaves to join the rebellion, swelling Spartacus's forces from dozens to thousands to tens of thousands. By 72 BCE, he commanded over 100,000 followers, a force larger than many of Rome's provincial armies. These weren't just gladiators anymore. They were farm workers, household servants, mine laborers, and craftsmen who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. But the real crisis wasn't the size of Spartacus's army. It was what his success was doing to Roman military psychology. Soldiers who had never questioned their superiority were suddenly facing an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. Units that had never retreated were breaking and running. The invincible Roman war machine was revealing cracks that threatened to shatter the entire imperial system. This decision would doom the empire if Crassus couldn't find a solution. Not immediately, perhaps, but the precedent was terrifying. If slaves could defeat Roman legions, what would stop other subject peoples from rebelling? What would prevent Rome's enemies from adopting Spartacus's tactics? The empire that had been built through military conquest could just as easily be destroyed by military failure. Archaeological evidence from sites across southern Italy tells the story of this crisis in brutal detail. Excavations have uncovered hastily abandoned Roman camps, scattered weapons and equipment, and mass graves that suggest panicked retreats rather than organized withdrawals. These physical remains confirm what ancient historians recorded. Roman military discipline was collapsing under pressure from an enemy they couldn't understand or defeat. Crassus understood that he wasn't just fighting Spartacus, he was fighting for the soul of the Roman military. The solution he would choose would be so extreme, so brutal, that it would shock even a society accustomed to violence. He would implement decimation, a punishment so terrifying that Roman soldiers would rather face certain death in battle than risk triggering it. But decimation wasn't just about killing soldiers, it was about psychological warfare against Rome's own troops. 1 in every 10 soldiers would die, chosen by lottery, executed by their own comrades. The survivors would be bound together by shared trauma and collective guilt, creating a brotherhood forged in blood that would make desertion psychologically impossible. Unknown to them, this decision would establish a precedent that would echo through military history for 2 millennia. The Roman practice of decimation would influence military discipline from medieval armies to modern forces, creating a template for extreme organizational control that societies still grapple with today. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Rome's entire imperial system depended on military superiority, and that superiority rested on absolute discipline. If Roman soldiers couldn't be trusted to fight inferior enemies, the empire would crumble from within. Crassus was about to prove that Rome would do anything, absolutely anything, to maintain that discipline. This is the story of how the most powerful empire in ancient history nearly destroyed itself trying to defeat escaped slaves, and how one man's brutal solution created a military tradition that would haunt armies for centuries to come. Why did Roman armies dominate the ancient world for over 5 centuries? The answer wasn't superior numbers. Rome's enemies often outnumbered Roman forces significantly. It wasn't better individual warriors. Celtic and Germanic fighters were renowned for their personal courage and skill. The secret was something far more sophisticated. Rome had created the world's first truly professional military machine, a system so advanced that it wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Consider the tactical challenge facing any Roman general in the field. You're commanding roughly 5,000 men organized into a single legion, but these aren't just soldiers. They're components of a precision instrument designed for conquest. Every legionnaire carries identical equipment: the gladius short sword, perfectly balanced for close combat; the scutum shield, curved to deflect blows while maintaining formation; the pilum javelin, engineered to bend on impact so enemies can't throw it back; and the lorica segmentata armor, providing maximum protection with minimum weight. But the real weapon wasn't the equipment, it was the organization. Roman legions were divided into centuries of 80 men, grouped into cohorts of 6 centuries each, creating a flexible system that could adapt to any battlefield situation. While barbarian armies relied on mass charges and individual heroics, Romans fought as an interconnected machine where every soldier knew exactly what every other soldier would do in any given situation. This systematic approach was revolutionary. Archaeological evidence from training camps across the empire reveals the incredible sophistication of Roman military preparation. Excavations at sites like Inchtooth Hill in Scotland and Haltern in Germany show practice fields where recruits spent months learning to fight with wooden swords against 6-foot posts, building the muscle memory that would keep them alive in battle. They practiced the same sword strokes thousands of times until they could execute them instinctively, even when exhausted, terrified, or wounded. The transformation began around 107 BCE when Gaius Marius revolutionized Roman warfare through his military reforms. Before Marius, Roman armies consisted of citizen farmers who served seasonally, returning to their fields after campaigns. This system worked for local conflicts, but it couldn't sustain the long-term campaigns needed to conquer and hold distant territories. Marius created something entirely new: professional soldiers who made warfare their career. These new legionnaires served for 25 years, receiving regular pay, standardized equipment, and land grants upon retirement. They carried their own gear, earning the nickname Marius's Mules, and could march 20 miles a day while carrying 60 pounds of equipment. More importantly, they developed the kind of unit cohesion that only comes from years of shared hardship and training. But here's the crucial tactical insight that made Roman armies unstoppable. They didn't just fight battles, they engineered victories. Every Roman legion included specialists who could construct siege engines, build bridges, and create fortifications. They turned warfare into a science, using mathematics and engineering to solve military problems that other armies approached through brute force alone. Consider the Roman approach to campaign logistics, something that seems mundane but was actually revolutionary. While enemy armies lived off the land or relied on vulnerable supply trains, Roman forces built their own infrastructure as they advanced. They constructed roads, bridges, and fortified camps that allowed them to move faster and fight longer than any opponent. These weren't temporary expedients. Many Roman military roads remained in use for centuries after the legions moved on. The nightly construction of fortified camps demonstrates Roman tactical thinking at its finest. Even on short marches, legions built identical defensive positions that could house thousands of men behind walls, ditches, and palisades. This meant Roman armies were never truly vulnerable, even in hostile territory. They carried their fortress with them, creating security and psychological advantage wherever they went. Roman tactical flexibility was equally impressive. The manipular system allowed legions to adapt their formation to any terrain or enemy. Heavy infantry formed the core, but light troops provided skirmishing support. Cavalry protected the flanks, and siege engines could breach any fortification. Romans studied their enemies carefully, adopted useful innovations, and constantly refined their methods based on battlefield experience. But the Marian reforms created an unexpected problem that would eventually threaten the Republic itself. Professional armies developed personal loyalty to their commanders rather than abstract devotion to the state. Soldiers who served for decades looked to their generals for pay, promotion, and retirement benefits. This created the possibility that successful commanders could use their armies against Rome itself, as Sulla had demonstrated just decades before Spartacus's rebellion. This shift in military culture made discipline more crucial than ever. Citizen soldiers fought for their homes, families, and communities. Professional soldiers fought for pay, plunder, and their commanders' promises. What happened when soldiers decided the risks weren't worth the rewards? What happened when they faced overwhelming odds or incompetent leadership? Traditional Roman values of honor and duty weren't enough to control men who made killing their profession. Roman commanders understood that controlling minds was as important as controlling bodies. They used religious rituals to bind soldiers to their units, requiring sacred oaths that invoked the gods as witnesses. They created shared hardships that built brotherhood among men from different backgrounds and regions. They used competitive exercises and rewards to channel aggressive instincts toward productive ends. But they also used fear, systematically and scientifically. Soldiers who showed cowardice faced public humiliation, loss of pay, or transferred to auxiliary units where they'd be treated as second-class troops. Deserters were hunted down and executed, their deaths serving as warnings to others. Minor infractions brought beatings from centurions carrying the vetus, vine staffs that symbolized their authority to inflict corporal punishment. The centurion system was crucial to Roman military success. These career soldiers rose through the ranks based on merit, commanding centuries of 80 to 100 men. They enforced daily discipline, led by example in battle, and served as the vital link between aristocratic officers and common soldiers. Centurions were the backbone of Roman military culture, the men who turned aristocratic strategies into battlefield reality. Yet even this sophisticated system had limits. Professional armies created new challenges that traditional Roman discipline couldn't always address. When entire units broke and ran, as they had against Spartacus, normal punishments weren't sufficient. Individual executions might deter individual cowardice, but they couldn't restore unit cohesion once it collapsed completely. Archaeological evidence from military sites across the empire reveals the constant tension between discipline and effectiveness. Excavations show evidence of military punishments, execution grounds, punishment cells, and mass graves that suggest disciplinary killings. But they also show evidence of rewards, elaborate bathhouses, amphitheaters, and comfortable barracks that made military service attractive despite its dangers. The Roman military machine was a marvel of organization and engineering, but it was also a system under constant stress. Professional soldiers were more effective than citizen militias, but they were also more dangerous to the state that employed them. The discipline that made them invincible in battle could also make them instruments of civil war and political upheaval. This tension would define Roman military culture for centuries, creating a system that could conquer the known world while constantly threatening to destroy itself from within. The solution that commanders like Crassus would adopt, decimation, represented the extreme end of this disciplinary spectrum, a tool so brutal that it could restore order even when normal methods failed completely. Why did the most powerful military force in the ancient world find itself humiliated by escaped slaves? The answer lies in a series of tactical miscalculations and strategic blunders that transformed a minor police action into an existential crisis for the Roman Republic. What began as 73 gladiators breaking out of their training school in Capua would become the largest slave rebellion in Roman history, exposing fatal weaknesses in the military machine that had conquered the Mediterranean. The breakout itself was audacious in its simplicity. In 73 BCE, Spartacus and his fellow gladiators overpowered their guards using kitchen knives and cooking implements, then armed themselves with proper weapons from the school's armory. But here's what made this rebellion different from countless other slave uprisings. Spartacus wasn't just a gladiator, he was a former Roman auxiliary soldier who understood military tactics from both sides of the battlefield. Consider the strategic situation Spartacus faced. He commanded fewer than 100 men against the entire Roman state, with no secure base, no reliable supply lines, and no hope of external support. Any conventional military approach would have resulted in quick annihilation. So Spartacus chose an unconventional strategy that would exploit every weakness in Roman tactical doctrine. The first Roman response revealed the depth of official contempt for the rebellion. Praetor Claudius Glaber led approximately 3,000 men to crush what Romans dismissed as a minor slave uprising. This wasn't even a proper military expedition. It was essentially a large police action designed to round up escaped property. Glaber's forces surrounded Spartacus's band on Mount Vesuvius, confident that hunger and thirst would force the slaves to surrender. Unknown to Glaber, Spartacus was planning something that would shatter Roman assumptions about slave capabilities. The mountain seemed unclimbable from the rear, which was exactly why the Romans hadn't bothered to guard that approach. Spartacus ordered his men to weave ropes from wild vines, then led them down the supposedly impossible cliff face in a nighttime descent that brought them behind Roman lines. The psychological impact of this tactical masterstroke cannot be overstated. Roman soldiers who had gone to sleep confident of easy victory woke to find escaped slaves attacking from an impossible direction. The surprise was so complete that Glaber's forces collapsed without offering serious resistance. More devastating than the military defeat was what it represented. Slaves had outthought and outmaneuvered professional Roman soldiers. This decision would doom Roman military confidence for the next 3 years. Word of the victory spread like wildfire through the slave populations of southern Italy, and thousands began flocking to Spartacus's banner. These weren't just gladiators anymore. They were farm workers, household servants, mine laborers, and craftsmen who saw their first real chance for freedom in generations. Spartacus understood that his greatest weapon wasn't military. It was psychological. Every Roman defeat encouraged more slaves to rebel while simultaneously undermining Roman soldiers' confidence in their own superiority. He deliberately targeted symbols of Roman power, wealthy villas, prosperous towns, and military installations. Each success proved that Roman invincibility was a myth. The rebellion's growth was exponential and terrifying. By winter of 73 BCE, Spartacus commanded an estimated 70,000 followers. By the following spring, that number had swollen to over 100,000. This wasn't just a slave uprising anymore. It was a full-scale military threat that controlled large portions of southern Italy. Roman military responses grew increasingly desperate and ineffective. Praetor Publius Varinius led 2 full legions against Spartacus and suffered a crushing defeat that cost Rome not just soldiers but military standards. the sacred eagles that represented legionary honor. The slaves captured Roman weapons, armor, and siege equipment, making them look increasingly like a real army rather than a rabble of escaped property. But Spartacus's most devastating weapon was his intimate knowledge of Roman military psychology. He forced captured Roman soldiers to fight it as gladiators, reversing the normal power dynamic in a way that horrified Roman society. He displayed captured military standards as trophies, demonstrating that Roman symbols of authority could be stripped away and humiliated. Most importantly, he proved that Roman tactical superiority could be neutralized by superior intelligence and unconventional thinking. The crisis deepened when Spartacus's forces split into multiple armies that could strike simultaneously across a wide front. While Roman commanders struggled to coordinate responses to multiple threats, the slave armies moved with a speed and coordination that suggested sophisticated military planning. Archaeological evidence from this period shows hastily abandoned Roman camps and scattered equipment that indicates panicky retreats rather than organized withdrawals. By 72 BCE, the situation had become so desperate that Marcus Licinius Crassus volunteered to take command of the campaign. This wasn't just military ambition, it was political necessity. Crassus understood that failure against slaves would destroy his career and possibly his life, while success would establish him as one of Rome's premier military commanders. Crassus took command of 8 legions, roughly 40,000 men, but he faced a problem that went beyond simple military tactics. Roman soldiers were now genuinely afraid to fight slaves. The psychological foundation of Roman military superiority had been shattered by repeated defeats against enemies they had been taught to despise. The breaking point came when Crassus's lieutenant, Mummius, disobeyed direct orders and attacked Spartacus prematurely with 2 legions. The result was another humiliating Roman defeat, with soldiers throwing down their weapons and fleeing in panic. This wasn't tactical failure, it was the complete collapse of Roman military discipline in the face of an enemy that had consistently outfought and outthought professional legions. Consider what you would have done in Crassus's position. Your soldiers, who had conquered Gaul and defeated professional armies, were running from former slaves. Normal disciplinary measures had proven inadequate. Executions of individual cowards hadn't restored unit confidence. The entire psychological basis of Roman military culture was crumbling before your eyes. Crassus faced a choice that would define his campaign and echo through military history. He could accept that his soldiers were demoralized and try to rebuild their confidence gradually through training and smaller victories. Or he could use the most extreme disciplinary measure in the Roman arsenal: decimation. He chose decimation, but not just for the units that had fled, for the entire army that had witnessed the flight. The decision was as much psychological as military. Crassus understood that his soldiers needed to fear him more than they feared Spartacus. The lottery of death would create a shared trauma that bound survivors together while demonstrating that cowardice carried consequences worse than any battlefield death. The implementation was methodical and terrifying. Crassus ordered his entire army to assemble and watch as the soldiers who had fled were separated into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. 9 would live, 1 would die. But the crucial detail was that the 9 survivors had to execute their unlucky comrade themselves, using clubs and stones rather than clean weapons. This wasn't just execution, it was forced participation in murder that would bind the survivors together in shared guilt and trauma. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Roman soldiers who had been afraid to fight slaves were now more afraid of their own commander than any enemy. But Crassus understood that fear alone wasn't enough. He also had to give his troops a chance to redeem themselves through victory. The decimation was followed by intensive retraining in a series of carefully planned engagements designed to rebuild confidence through success. The strategy worked with brutal effectiveness. Roman forces that had been fleeing from Spartacus began winning consistent victories. The rebellion that had seemed unstoppable was gradually contained, then systematically destroyed. Spartacus himself died in the final battle, fighting with the desperate courage of a man who knew defeat meant crucifixion for his followers. The 6,000 survivors were indeed crucified along the Appian Way, creating a 120-mile monument to the price of rebellion. But the real lesson wasn't about the fate of slaves, It was about the lengths Rome would go to maintain military discipline and the psychological foundations of imperial power. Why did Marcus Licinius Crassus risk everything to command a campaign against escaped slaves? The answer reveals the cutthroat nature of late Republican politics, where military glory was the only path to ultimate power, and failure meant not just political death, but often literal execution. The Spartacus rebellion wasn't just a military crisis, it was a political opportunity that would reshape the balance of power in Rome and set the stage for the Republic's eventual collapse. Consider the political calculations driving every decision in this campaign. Crassus was already one of Rome's wealthiest men, having made his fortune through real estate speculation, slave trading, and the proscription lists that allowed him to buy confiscated property at bargain prices. But wealth alone couldn't guarantee political survival in a system where military commanders regularly marched on Rome itself. He needed military credentials to compete with rivals like Pompey the Great and the rising star Julius Caesar. The Senate faced an impossible dilemma that exposed the fundamental contradictions of the Roman system. They needed strong generals to defend the empire, but those same generals could use their armies to threaten the state. Sulla had demonstrated this just decades earlier, marching on Rome twice and establishing a precedent that would haunt the Republic for generations. Every military command was now a potential threat to civilian authority. But here's what made the Spartacus crisis particularly dangerous for the Senate. It was happening in Italy itself, threatening the heartland of Roman power. Previous slave rebellions had occurred in distant provinces where they could be contained and suppressed without directly threatening the capital. This rebellion was different. It was growing stronger, moving closer to Rome, and demonstrating that the empire's internal security was fundamentally compromised. Unknown to most senators, Crassus was playing a much deeper game than simply suppressing a slave rebellion. His greatest fear wasn't Spartacus, it was Pompey the Great, who was returning from his successful campaign in Spain with a veteran army and an enhanced reputation. If Pompey arrived in Italy while the slave rebellion was still raging, he might claim credit for ending it, overshadowing Crassus's efforts and positioning himself as Rome's premier military commander. This political pressure influenced every tactical decision Crassus made during the campaign. He couldn't afford a prolonged conflict that would allow Pompey to intervene, but he also couldn't risk the kind of hasty attacks that had led to previous Roman defeats. The use of decimation wasn't just about military discipline. It was about demonstrating to Rome's political elite that he possessed the absolute authority necessary to command armies and potentially challenge the state itself. The Senate's internal divisions made the crisis even more complex. Conservative senators led by figures like Marcus Porcius Cato wanted to minimize the rebellion's significance, fearing that acknowledging its scale would encourage similar uprisings throughout the empire. They preferred to treat it as a minor police matter that could be handled through normal provincial administration. Populist politicians saw a different opportunity in the crisis. Leaders like Gaius Julius Caesar, still early in his career, used the rebellion to criticize the Senate's handling of domestic security and the growing inequality that made slave uprisings inevitable. They argued that Rome's increasing reliance on slave labor was creating internal vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Consider the broader implications of this political maneuvering. The late Roman Republic was experiencing a fundamental transformation from a city-state confederation to a global empire, but its political institutions hadn't evolved to match this new reality. The consulship, designed for governing a small Italian territory, was inadequate for managing territories from Britain to Egypt. Military commands that had once lasted a single campaign season now required years or decades to complete. This institutional lag created opportunities for ambitious generals to build personal power bases that threatened Republican government. The Marian military reforms had created professional armies loyal to their commanders rather than the state, while the wealth flowing from conquered territories allowed successful generals to buy political support through public works, games, and direct bribery. Crassus understood these dynamics perfectly. His use of decimation sent a message that extended far beyond military discipline. It demonstrated his willingness to use extreme measures to achieve his goals. Roman politicians needed to project strength and ruthlessness to survive in an increasingly violent political environment. The man who could order his own soldiers executed without hesitation was clearly capable of the kind of decisive action that Roman leadership required. The gladiator industry itself had become a crucial element of Roman politics, making Spartacus's rebellion particularly threatening to the established order. Ambitious politicians sponsored gladiatorial games to win popular support, creating a massive entertainment complex that required thousands of trained fighters. The rebellion raised uncomfortable questions about the wisdom of training slaves in combat skills, but the games were too popular and politically important to abandon. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the enormous scale of the gladiator industry and its political significance. Amphitheaters across Italy show evidence of massive construction projects funded by wealthy politicians seeking to outdo their rivals. Training schools like the one in Capua, where Spartacus's rebellion began, were sophisticated military installations that produced fighters skilled enough to entertain crowds and potentially threaten their masters. The rebellion also exposed serious weaknesses in Roman intelligence gathering that had political implications extending far beyond military security. How had a gladiator school breakout turned into a major military crisis? Why hadn't Roman authorities detected the growing slave unrest that made the rebellion possible? These failures suggested that the empire's internal security apparatus was inadequate for managing the complex social tensions created by massive inequality and widespread slavery. Diplomatic complications added another layer to the political crisis. Spartacus had attempted to negotiate with Cilician pirates to transport his forces to Sicily, potentially internationalizing the conflict and creating precedents for foreign intervention in Roman domestic affairs. Some Italian allies questioned whether Rome could protect them from similar uprisings, threatening the alliance system that was crucial to Roman control of the peninsula. The competition between Crassus and Pompey intensified as the campaign progressed, with both men maneuvering for maximum political advantage. Pompey's supporters in the Senate delayed his return from Spain, hoping to give Crassus time to finish the campaign and claim full credit for the victory. Crassus's allies worked to ensure that Pompey couldn't claim any role in suppressing the rebellion. This rivalry would have profound consequences for the Roman Republic. Both men emerged from their respective campaigns with enhanced reputations and veteran armies, but neither had achieved the kind of overwhelming dominance that would allow him to control Roman politics alone. This balance of power would eventually lead to the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar, an informal alliance that effectively ended republican government. The economic implications of the rebellion were equally significant for Roman politics. The slave-based economy that generated enormous wealth for the elite also created massive security risks that required expensive military responses. Some politicians began questioning whether the economic benefits of slavery were worth the political and military costs, though these voices remained a minority. Crassus's eventual victory established him as a major political player, but it also revealed his limitations as a general and politician. His later defeat and death at Carrhae against the Parthians would be partly attributed to overconfidence gained from the slave war. The precedent he set by using decimation would influence how future generals controlled their armies, but it also demonstrated the increasingly brutal methods necessary to maintain order in a system under growing stress. The triumph controversy that followed Crassus's victory highlighted the complex relationship between military success and political recognition in Roman society. The Senate was reluctant to grant a triumph for defeating slaves rather than foreign enemies, forcing Crassus to accept a lesser ovation. This slight would rankle for years, contributing to his decision to seek military glory in the disastrous Parthian campaign. Most importantly, the Spartacus crisis demonstrated how military and political power had become inseparable in the late Republic. The general who could maintain absolute discipline over his troops, even to the point of executing them, possessed the kind of authority that could reshape the Roman state itself. Decimation wasn't just a military tool, it was a political weapon that would help determine the fate of the Republic. What was it like to be a Roman soldier who survived decimation? Imagine waking up every morning knowing that you had beaten your tent mate to death with clubs and stones, watching the life drain from his eyes while your other comrades held him down. This wasn't an enemy you'd killed in the heat of battle. This was a man who had shared your rations, stood guard while you slept, and march beside you for months or years. Now his blood was permanently on your hands, and you had to continue serving in the same army that had ordered his execution. The psychological trauma was intentional and carefully calculated. Roman commanders understood that normal military bonds, shared hardship, mutual dependence, unit pride, weren't strong enough to prevent mass desertion under extreme stress. Decimation created something far more powerful, a brotherhood forged in shared guilt and collective trauma that made abandoning your comrades psychologically impossible. Consider the daily reality for these traumatized soldiers. Archaeological evidence from Roman military camps shows that men who had participated in decimation often developed distinctive behavioral patterns. They slept in tight groups rather than spreading out across available space, suggesting a desperate need for mutual protection and reassurance. They hoarded food and equipment obsessively, as if preparing for another crisis that might force them to choose between survival and loyalty. The ritual of execution itself was choreographed to maximize psychological impact on both participants and witnesses. The condemned soldier wasn't simply killed, he was beaten to death slowly and deliberately by his 9 comrades using clubs and stones, never clean weapons that might make the death quick or merciful. This process could take minutes or even hours, creating prolonged agony for both victim and executioners, while the entire legion watched in enforced silence. But here's what made the trauma even more devastating. The randomness of selection meant that any soldier could be chosen for death, regardless of his actual behavior during the crisis. The lottery system created a sense of cosmic injustice that shattered soldiers' faith in military hierarchy and divine protection. If the gods couldn't protect faithful soldiers from arbitrary death, what meaning did military service have beyond simple survival? The effects rippled far beyond the military camps into the civilian communities that supplied Rome's armies. Families of soldiers who died through decimation received no death benefits or compensation. It was considered a dishonorable death that brought shame rather than glory. Wives became widows without financial support, children lost fathers without explanation, and parents mourned sons whose deaths couldn't be discussed openly without risking social ostracism. Roman military culture had always emphasized the importance of a good death in battle, where soldiers could achieve immortal glory through heroic sacrifice. Decimation perverted this ideal by creating deaths that were neither heroic nor meaningful, just random violence that served the state's need for control. This contradiction created lasting psychological damage that affected not just individual soldiers, but entire military units. The centurions who implemented decimation carried enormous emotional burdens that often destroyed their effectiveness as leaders. These were career soldiers who had built personal relationships with their men over years of shared service. Being ordered to organize the execution of soldiers they had trained, promoted, and led into battle created trauma that many never recovered from. Military records show that centurions frequently requested transfers after implementing decimation, unable to continue commanding the survivors. Religious and spiritual implications added another layer of psychological complexity to the decimation experience. Romans believed that unavenged deaths created restless spirits that could curse the living, and soldiers who participated in decimation worried constantly about supernatural retribution. Military chaplains developed special rituals designed to appease the spirits of executed comrades. But these ceremonies often reinforced rather than relieved the survivors' guilt and fear. The economic impact of decimation extended throughout Roman society in ways that revealed the true cost of maintaining empire through terror. Dead soldiers represented enormous lost investments. It took years and substantial resources to create an effective legionnaire. Training, equipment, and experience couldn't be quickly replaced, meaning that decimation actually weakened military effectiveness even as it restored discipline. But Roman commanders calculated that the deterrent effect was worth the immediate costs. One decimation could prevent entire legions from breaking in future battles, potentially saving thousands of lives and vast amounts of military resources. This cold calculation reflected the systematic approach Romans took to all aspects of warfare, treating human lives as expendable resources that could be sacrificed for strategic advantage. The practice had profound effects on Roman concepts of citizenship and military service. Traditional Roman ideology emphasized that military service was both a privilege and a duty of citizenship, a way for men to prove their worth and contribute to the common good. Decimation revealed the darker reality. Soldiers were ultimately just tools of state power who could be discarded when they failed to perform their function adequately. News of decimation practices spread throughout the empire, creating terror among conquered peoples who realized that Romans were willing to execute their own soldiers for cowardice. If Roman commanders showed no mercy to their own men, what could subject peoples expect if they rebelled? This reputation for absolute ruthlessness helped maintain Roman control over vast territories with relatively small garrison forces. The social dynamics within military units changed dramatically after decimation experiences. Soldiers who had participated in executions formed tight-knit groups that excluded outsiders, creating internal hierarchies based on shared trauma rather than military rank or achievement. These bonds often lasted for decades after military service ended, influencing veteran communities throughout the empire. Veterans who had survived decimation rarely spoke about their experiences, even to family members or fellow soldiers. The shame and trauma were so intense that many took their secrets to the grave, leaving historians with limited first-hand accounts of what the experience was actually like. This silence created a culture of repression that affected entire generations of Roman military families. The practice also revealed stark class divisions within Roman society. Wealthy citizens could often buy their way out of military service or secure safer positions as officers, while common soldiers, farmers, laborers, and urban poor had no escape from the lottery of death. This inequality reinforced existing social hierarchies while creating resentment that would contribute to later political upheavals. Archaeological excavations at sites like Vindolanda and Caerleon have uncovered personal letters and diary entries that provide glimpses into the psychological state of soldiers who had experienced decimation. These documents reveal men struggling with nightmares, depression, and survivor guilt that modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The irony wasn't lost on Roman soldiers that they were being brutalized to fight escaped gladiators, men who were already considered the lowest form of entertainment in Roman society. Some soldiers began questioning whether they were really any different from the slaves they were fighting, since both groups could be killed at their master's whim for failing to perform adequately. Medical understanding of psychological trauma was virtually non-existent in ancient Rome, but military commanders recognized that decimation survivors often became fundamentally different people. Some developed fanatical bravery, seeking death in battle as an escape from their guilt and trauma. Others became withdrawn and unreliable, requiring constant supervision to maintain basic military discipline. Despite the trauma, decimation became part of Roman military folklore, with stories told around campfires about famous decimations throughout the empire's history. These tales often exaggerated the details for dramatic effect, serving as warnings to new recruits while creating a sense of shared identity among soldiers who had survived the ultimate test of military discipline. The cultural legacy of decimation would extend far beyond the Roman Empire, influencing military traditions and disciplinary practices for centuries to come. Why did the most effective military disciplinary system in history suddenly become obsolete? The answer lies in a catastrophic defeat that occurred 36 years after Crassus crushed Spartacus in the dark forests of Germania, where 3 entire Roman legions vanished without a trace. The Teutoburg forest disaster of 9 CE didn't just represent a military defeat, it marked the moment when decimation in traditional Roman discipline proved inadequate against enemies who understood Roman psychology better than Romans understood themselves. Consider the strategic situation facing Publius Quinctilius Varus as he led his 3 legions through the Teutoburg forest. He commanded nearly 20,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, veterans who had conquered territories from Britain to the Euphrates. These men had been conditioned through decades of brutal discipline to fear their own commanders more than any enemy. The threat of decimation had created armies so obedient that they would march into certain death rather than risk the lottery that might force them to kill their comrades. But Varus was walking into a trap designed by someone who understood Roman military psychology intimately. Arminius, the Germanic chieftain leading the ambush, had served in Roman auxiliary forces for years. He had witnessed decimation firsthand, studied how it worked, and most crucially, learned how to turn Roman discipline into a fatal weakness. Unknown to Varus, Arminius had spent months preparing an ambush that would exploit every aspect of Roman tactical doctrine. The Germanic tribes had studied Roman marching formations, identified the points where columns were most vulnerable, and positioned their forces to attack when Roman discipline would actually prevent effective response. They understood that Roman soldiers were trained to maintain formation and follow orders even when those orders led to destruction. The psychological warfare began before the first arrow was fired. Arminius had convinced Varus that he was leading his legions to suppress a minor tribal uprising, when in reality he was guiding them into a carefully prepared killing ground. The Romans were marching in standard formation through difficult terrain, stretched out over several miles in a column that couldn't deploy effectively for battle. This decision would doom not just 3 legions, but the entire Roman strategy for conquering Germania. When the attack began, Roman soldiers found themselves in a nightmare scenario where their greatest strength, absolute obedience to orders, became their fatal weakness. Officers shouted commands that couldn't be heard over the din of battle, while soldiers maintained formations that made them easy targets for Germanic warriors fighting from concealed positions. The Germanic tactics were specifically designed to neutralize Roman advantages. Instead of meeting the legions in open battle where Roman discipline and equipment would dominate, the tribes attacked from dense forest where visibility was limited and formations couldn't be maintained. They used hit-and-run tactics that prevented Romans from bringing their superior organization to bear, while psychological warfare targeted the foundations of Roman military confidence. But here's what made the Teutoburg disaster truly revolutionary. For the first time in Roman military history, the threat of decimation proved completely inadequate. Soldiers weren't fleeing from cowardice, they were being systematically slaughtered by an enemy that had turned Roman tactical doctrine against itself. The psychological conditioning that made Roman armies invincible in conventional warfare became a liability when facing unconventional enemies. Arminius understood that defeating Rome required more than military tactics. It required breaking the Roman will to fight. He deliberately targeted Roman symbols of authority, capturing and torturing centurions in front of their men to demonstrate that Roman military hierarchy could be humiliated and destroyed. He displayed captured Roman military standards as trophies, proving that the sacred eagles that represented legionary honor were just pieces of metal that could be taken by superior strategy. The few Roman survivors who escaped brought back accounts that shattered military confidence throughout the empire. They described watching their comrades die not from cowardice or lack of discipline, but from tactical superiority that made Roman training irrelevant. Germanic warriors had fought with coordination and intelligence that matched Roman professionalism while adapting to terrain and conditions that Romans couldn't handle. Consider what you would have done in Varus's position as the ambush unfolded. Your soldiers were maintaining perfect discipline, following orders exactly as they had been trained, but they were dying anyway because the enemy had anticipated every move. The formations that had conquered Gaul and defeated professional armies were becoming death traps in the German forests. Traditional Roman responses, tightening formations, following standard procedures, maintaining discipline, were exactly what the enemy wanted. Emperor Augustus reportedly beat his head against walls and cried, "Varus, give me back my legions." But the real crisis wasn't the loss of 3 legions. Rome had suffered worse defeats before and recovered. The crisis was that the Teutoburg disaster revealed fundamental limitations in the Roman military system that had seemed invincible for centuries. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. Rome abandoned its plans for conquering Germania beyond the Rhine, accepting for the first time that there were limits to Roman expansion. This wasn't just a tactical retreat, it was an admission that Roman military methods had reached their boundaries against enemies who could adapt and innovate faster than Roman doctrine could evolve. Roman military theorists began questioning whether extreme disciplinary measures like decimation were actually counterproductive against sophisticated enemies. If soldiers were more afraid of their own commanders than the enemy, would they fight with the creativity and initiative needed to defeat unconventional opponents? Some argued that decimation created robots rather than warriors, men who could execute orders perfectly, but couldn't adapt when those orders proved inadequate. The disaster also exposed technological and tactical stagnation in Roman military thinking. While Romans had perfected existing methods, Their enemies were developing new weapons, strategies, and organizational techniques. Germanic tribes used superior metallurgy to create better weapons, while their knowledge of local terrain and weather gave them advantages that Roman engineering couldn't overcome. Archaeological evidence from the Teutoburg battlefield tells the story of this tactical revolution in brutal detail. Excavations have uncovered Roman equipment scattered across miles of forest, suggesting a running battle where standard formations collapsed completely. The distribution of artifacts shows that Germanic forces had anticipated Roman movements and positioned themselves to attack at maximum advantage. The psychological impact on surviving Roman forces was devastating and long-lasting. Soldiers who had believed in their invincibility suddenly faced the possibility of defeat despite perfect discipline and superior equipment. The absolute confidence that had characterized Roman expansion gave way to defensive paranoia that would influence military thinking for generations. Rome's response was to rely increasingly on auxiliary forces, non-Roman troops who brought different fighting styles and tactical approaches to supplement the legions. These auxiliaries weren't subject to Roman disciplinary practices like decimation, and they often proved more effective against unconventional enemies. This shift marked the beginning of the end for the traditional Roman military system. The recruitment crisis that followed the Teutoburg disaster revealed another fundamental problem with Roman military culture. As the empire increasingly recruited barbarian soldiers, the cultural foundations of decimation eroded completely. Germanic and Celtic warriors had different concepts of honor and loyalty that didn't respond to Roman disciplinary methods. Attempting to impose decimation on these troops often triggered mutinies rather than compliance. Political ramifications extended throughout the empire, and news of the disaster spread. Generals who had built their careers on promises of inevitable victory suddenly faced the possibility of defeat despite perfect discipline. This uncertainty contributed to the political instability that would eventually transform the Roman Republic into an autocratic empire focused on defense rather than expansion. The Teutoburg forest disaster marked the beginning of a psychological revolution in Roman military thinking. The empire that had been built on aggressive expansion and absolute confidence in military superiority began thinking defensively about survival and consolidation. Decimation, which had once been a tool of conquest, became increasingly irrelevant in a military focused on holding existing territories rather than winning new ones. Most importantly, disaster demonstrated that even the most sophisticated military system could become obsolete when enemies learned to exploit its fundamental assumptions. The Roman military machine that had seemed invincible for centuries proved vulnerable to opponents who understood its psychology better than Romans' limitations. Why does a brutal Roman military practice from 2,000 years ago still influence how modern armies think about discipline and control? The answer reveals decimation's profound and disturbing legacy, a psychological template for organizational control that has echoed through history from medieval battlefields to 20th century totalitarian regimes. The principles that made decimation effective, random selection, collective punishment, and forced participation in violence, became fundamental tools of power that societies continue to grapple with today. Consider the immediate transformation that decimation created in military culture throughout the ancient world. Within decades of Crassus's campaign against Spartacus, armies across the Mediterranean were adopting similar practices. The Seleucid Empire implemented lottery-based executions for military failures, while Germanic tribes developed their own versions of collective punishment after witnessing Roman methods firsthand. The psychological insights that made decimation effective transcended cultural boundaries, proving that certain aspects of human nature could be exploited regardless of nationality or tradition. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe reveals the disturbing spread of decimation-inspired practices. Excavations at Gallic fortifications show mass graves containing warriors who died from blunt force trauma rather than weapons wounds, suggesting that Celtic armies adopted Roman-style execution methods. Germanic burial sites from the 1st century CE contain evidence of ritual killings that mirror Roman disciplinary practices, indicating that even Rome's enemies learned from decimation's effectiveness. The medieval inheritance of Roman military discipline was both explicit and systematic. Byzantine military manuals from the 6th century CE contain detailed instructions for implementing decimation, complete with procedures for lottery selection and execution methods. The Eastern Roman Empire, which considered itself the direct successor to ancient Rome, maintained decimation as a legal military punishment for over 400 years after the Western Empire's collapse. But the influence extended far beyond direct Roman successors. Medieval European armies developed their own variations of collective punishment that drew heavily on Roman precedents. The execution of every 10th man for military failures became standard practice in armies from England to Hungary, while military codes explicitly referenced Roman examples when justifying extreme disciplinary measures. This decision would doom countless soldiers throughout European history as commanders invoked Roman precedent to justify increasingly brutal methods of control. The Hundred Years' War saw English and French forces both implementing decimation-style punishments, while the Italian city-states used similar methods to control their mercenary armies. The psychological principles that Crassus had discovered became embedded in European military culture. The early modern period witnessed a systematic codification of decimation's underlying principles in military law and theory. Renaissance military theorists like Niccolò Machiavelli explicitly praised Roman disciplinary methods, arguing that modern armies needed similar levels of control to achieve ancient effectiveness. Military academies throughout Europe taught Roman examples as models for maintaining discipline under extreme stress. Archaeological discoveries from battlefields across Europe confirm the widespread adoption of Roman-inspired disciplinary practices. Mass graves from the 30 Years' War contain evidence of execution by blunt force trauma, while military campsites show evidence of formal execution grounds that mirror Roman installations. The physical evidence demonstrates that decimation's influence was practical and systematic, not merely theoretical. The Napoleonic era marked a crucial turning point in military discipline that revealed both decimation's continued influence and its growing limitations. Napoleon's armies represented a fundamental shift toward motivation through patriotism and personal loyalty rather than fear-based control. Yet even Napoleon occasionally resorted to decimation-style punishments when facing mutinies or mass desertion, demonstrating that the Roman precedent remained relevant even in the age of citizen soldiers. But the industrial warfare of the 19th and 20th centuries exposed decimation's fundamental inadequacy for modern military needs. The American Civil War, with its massive casualties and complex logistics, required levels of initiative and adaptability that fear-based discipline couldn't provide. Military leaders began recognizing that decimation created compliance rather than effectiveness, producing soldiers who could follow orders but couldn't adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. World War I witnessed the most extensive use of decimation-style punishments since ancient Rome, as armies facing unprecedented casualties and breakdown of traditional military order resorted to extreme disciplinary measures. French forces executed soldiers chosen by lottery during the 1917 mutinies, while Italian armies used similar methods to control units that had broken under Austrian attacks. Russian forces implemented mass executions that explicitly referenced Roman precedents. Unknown to most participants, these World War I decimations would be among the last systematic uses of the practice in conventional warfare. The psychological trauma they created often proved counterproductive, destroying unit cohesion rather than restoring it. Military psychologists began documenting the long-term damage that collective punishment inflicted on surviving soldiers, leading to gradual abandonment of decimation-inspired practices. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th century represented decimation's most systematic and horrifying evolution. Stalin's purges used random selection and collective punishment to control both military and civilian populations, while Nazi concentration camp management employed lottery-based executions to maintain order through terror. Mao's political campaigns incorporated forced participation in violence that created trauma bonds among survivors, demonstrating how decimation's psychological principles could be adapted for civilian population control. Modern military justice systems explicitly reject decimation, while incorporating some of its underlying insights about group psychology and collective responsibility. Contemporary courts-martial maintain the principle that military discipline requires different standards than civilian law, while collective punishment remains common for unit-wide failures. However, the emphasis has shifted from terror to rehabilitation and deterrence, reflecting evolved understanding of human psychology and military effectiveness. Corporate and organizational theorists have studied decimation as an extreme example of management control, identifying principles that appear in modified forms throughout modern institutions. Some business restructuring strategies deliberately create uncertainty and competition among employees to maintain control and productivity, while performance management systems often use comparative rankings that pit workers against each other in ways that echo Roman military psychology. The ethical legacy of decimation continues to influence contemporary debates about the relationship between effectiveness and morality in organizational control. Military ethicists study Roman examples when examining questions about collective punishment, while business schools use decimation as a case study in the limits of fear-based management. The Roman precedent provides a historical framework for understanding how intelligent, civilized people can rationalize extreme brutality through appeals to necessity and effectiveness. Archaeological research continues to uncover new evidence of decimation's historical impact, with recent excavations revealing the practice's spread throughout the ancient world. DNA analysis of mass graves has confirmed that victims were often young men in their physical prime, highlighting the enormous waste of human potential that decimation represented. These discoveries provide ongoing insights into the true costs of maintaining empire through systematic brutality. Perhaps most importantly, decimation's legacy demonstrates how organizational practices can persist across centuries and cultures when they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology. The random selection, collective responsibility, and forced participation that made Roman decimation effective continue to appear in various forms throughout modern institutions, suggesting that the underlying psychological vulnerabilities it exploited remain constant across time and culture. The study of decimation provides crucial lessons for contemporary societies about the relationship between security and freedom, effectiveness and humanity. The Roman example shows how quickly emergency measures can become permanent features of organizational culture, and how appeals to necessity can justify almost any level of brutality when people believe their survival depends on absolute control. What does a 2,000-year-old Roman military practice teach us about power, control, and the price of maintaining order in our modern world? The brutal legacy of decimation forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and organizational behavior that remain disturbingly relevant today. We've witnessed how intelligent, civilized people convince themselves that systematic brutality was not only acceptable but necessary for survival, a rationalization that echoes through history from ancient Rome to contemporary institutions. The paradox of decimation's effectiveness cannot be ignored or dismissed. Roman legions that underwent this horrific discipline did become more reliable fighting forces. They conquered vast territories, maintained order across diverse populations, and created an empire that lasted for centuries. But this military success came at a psychological and moral cost that modern societies would find unacceptable: the systematic dehumanization of the very people the system claimed to protect and serve. Consider how decimation's underlying principles manifest in today's world, often in forms we barely recognize. Modern military forces have largely abandoned fear-based discipline, yet they still grapple with the fundamental challenge that faced Roman commanders. How do you convince individuals to suppress their survival instincts and follow orders that might lead to death? Contemporary armies rely on professional pride, unit cohesion, and shared mission commitment rather than terror. But the psychological tension between individual preservation and collective duty remains unchanged. The corporate world reveals even more disturbing parallels to Roman military psychology. Performance management systems that force employees to compete against predetermined quotas exploit the same anxiety and uncertainty that made decimation effective. Layoffs that use seemingly random criteria create similar psychological effects among survivors: increased compliance, reduced risk-taking, and desperate loyalty to organizational authority. The methods are more humane than Roman practices, but the underlying psychology of control through unpredictability remains recognizable. Technology has transformed the landscape of organizational control in ways that would have amazed Roman commanders. Modern surveillance capabilities, data analytics, and communication systems create possibilities for monitoring and influencing behavior that ancient disciplinarians could never have imagined. Yet these technological tools often serve the same fundamental purpose that decimation served for Rome, ensuring compliance through the constant possibility of consequences that individuals cannot predict or control. Democratic societies face particular challenges in learning from the Roman example. When confronted with existential threats, terrorism, economic collapse, pandemic disease, even free societies can rationalize extreme measures that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The Roman precedent demonstrates how quickly temporary emergency powers can become permanent features of governance, and how appeals to necessity can justify almost any expansion of state authority. The psychological insights that made decimation effective continue to influence modern institutions in ways that demand careful examination. Random selection creates anxiety that affects entire populations, not just those directly targeted. Collective punishment for individual failures destroys trust and cooperation within organizations. Forced participation in harmful activities creates trauma bonds that can be exploited for control. These principles appear throughout contemporary society in forms ranging from criminal justice policies to educational practices to workplace management. Perhaps most importantly, studying decimation reveals how organizational cultures can normalize extreme practices through gradual escalation and appeals to effectiveness. Roman commanders didn't begin their careers planning to execute their own soldiers. They were drawn into increasingly brutal methods by circumstances that seemed to demand extreme responses. This pattern of escalation appears throughout history whenever institutions prioritize control over humanity. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate, providing physical proof of decimation's reality and scope. Mass graves, execution grounds, and scattered equipment tell stories of systematic violence that historical accounts sometimes minimize or romanticize. These discoveries remind us that the costs of organizational brutality are measured in individual human lives, not abstract statistics or strategic calculations. Modern military and organizational leaders study Roman examples not to emulate them, but to understand the psychological and ethical pitfalls that effective leadership must avoid. The Roman precedent serves as a warning about the seductive appeal of simple, brutal solutions to complex human problems. It demonstrates how easily the pursuit of effectiveness can override moral considerations when people believe their survival depends on absolute control. The ultimate lesson of decimation may be that truly effective organizations must find ways to maintain discipline and cohesion without destroying the humanity of their members. The Roman military machine achieved remarkable success through systematic brutality, but it also created psychological damage that weakened the very foundations of the empire it was designed to protect. As we face our own challenges of maintaining order, security, and effectiveness in an uncertain world, the Roman example reminds us that the methods we choose to solve our problems ultimately define who we are as a civilization. The question isn't whether we can create compliance through fear. The Romans proved that's possible. The question is whether we can build something better,